All right, we'll go ahead and kick off. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Sophia Arend, and I'm the Global Blockchain Business Council's Communications and Content Lead. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the GBBC and Global Digital Finance's Global Leaders Series. This is a weekly global town hall we host with policymakers and business leaders to hear insights into their work and the state of the blockchain and digital asset industry, as well as current global affairs. Today, we have the pleasure to be joined by Dr. Tomicah Tillemann, Executive Director of the Digital Impact and Governance Initiative at New America, and a GBBC Board Director. Our host today is GBBC CEO and GDF Board Director Sandra Ro. They were joining us today for a conversation and live audience Q&A on building next generation digital infrastructure to power the public sector, the future of digital public goods, and how blockchain can help. Just briefly before we begin, I'd like to introduce Tomicah. As I mentioned, he is the Executive Director of the Digital Impact and Governance Initiative, also known as DIGI at New America. He works in collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Bank, MIT, and governments around the world to develop a new generation of open source technology platforms to power the public sector. He also oversees the work of the Blockchain Trust Accelerator, BTA, and the Responsive Asset Allocator Initiative, RAAI. The BTA works with organizations to develop decentralized technology solutions that address governance and social impact challenges worldwide. And the RAII ranks sovereign wealth and pension funds with combined assets of $20 trillion based on their strategies for managing social, governance, and environmental risks. Prior to joining New America, Tillemann served as a senior advisor to 2 secretaries of state, leading a team of experts that built 20 major initiatives in 55 countries. He joined the State Department in 2009 as Hillary Clinton's speechwriter and collaborated with her on over 200 speeches. Previously, he spent 4 years on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working with Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Barack Obama. As I mentioned, he is also board chair of the GBBC. We're so pleased to have him here with us today, and we welcome your questions at any point during today's webinar. You can submit them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And without further ado, I'll hand things off to Sandra to start. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. And I am just so delighted to be able to spend a bit of time with my fellow colleague and friend, Tomicah Tillemann. Tomicah, let's just dive right in because we've got a lot to unpack in the next 50 minutes. And we need to solve the world's problems, right? In the next 50 minutes.
It wouldn't be a conversation with you if we weren't solving the world's problems.
You are too kind. So let's start with your U.S. government experience, because I don't think everyone fully understands. They know you in the blockchain space, but perhaps not as much in the experience that you've had with the U.S. government. Could you just walk us through the journey that you had and how you got involved?
Absolutely, and thanks to you and Sophia for that overly generous introduction. It's wonderful to be with the GBBC family anytime, but especially at a moment when there's a lot of exciting work going on in our ecosystem and around the world. My U.S. government service began now a long time ago, probably 4 years back than I care to remember. I was finishing up a PhD and was, after a long period of courtship, asked to go to work for Joe Biden on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is a fascinating body. It is the Senate's preeminent instrument for engaging on global affairs. I was responsible for a portfolio of about 55 countries around the world. And we looked at a lot of challenges at the intersection of innovation and democracy. I covered everything within this vast portfolio, but I spent most of my time at the intersection of innovation and democracy. And in the course of that work, I had a couple of amazing opportunities. I was able to collaborate very closely with Joe Biden, the current president, and we traveled all over the world together and did a lot of projects and legislative initiatives together. And our staff director on the Foreign Relations Committee was a guy named Tony Blinken, who is now Secretary of State. And so was fortunate to work with just some exceptionally talented, capable individuals early in my time in government. After 4 years on the Foreign Relations Committee, we had a bit of a surprise when Joe Biden was elected or selected as vice president.
Right.
Following the 2008 election, I was asked, much to my shock, to go over and serve as Secretary Clinton's speechwriter at the State Department. This was not a job I had aspired to or frankly even considered previously, but for a variety of reasons, including a very generous recommendation from Tony Blinken, who had previously served as President Clinton's top foreign policy speechwriter, I ended up in that role. It was an incredible education. We collaborated on hundreds of different speeches, including a seminal speech on internet freedom and a lot of work on technology and democracy. And eventually, after serving in that capacity for a while, Secretary Clinton came to me on the plane one day as we were flying back from Lithuania, I believe.
Hmm.
She said, Tomicah, we've got a problem in the world, which is that our planet is evolving a lot faster and societies are changing a lot more quickly than our bureaucracy. And she asked me, by virtue of that, if I would stand up an office reporting directly to her that would operate a little bit like a State Department equivalent of DARPA, for those of you that know the Defense Department's Advanced Research and Projects Agency. And so we built out a series of projects around the world in over 50 countries that brought together technology, innovation, governance, and civil society, looking at new models for how you could solve problems and new models for how the State Department could engage with the world. We spent a lot of time thinking about technology and benchmarking countries like Estonia that have done really amazing things when it comes to rethinking digital infrastructure. And based on that experience, I ended up doing a lot of the work that I am right now, which we can discuss in greater detail later.
That is phenomenal. And when you think about how you started off so early in your career, already thinking about the crossroads and the cross section between technology, innovation, and democracy, how timely is it now that you are absolutely, again, in the eye of the storm in many ways? And I want to unpack some of that. But let's take the audience back to the origins of GBBC, because even though we've said that you've acted as our board chair and are on the board of directors now, frankly, you are a founder and you are the OG of why GBBC exists. Do you mind sharing that story? Because I was there, but I could not take credit for, having incubated this idea. So please, Tomicah, share with the audience.
Well, very much a team effort. I was fortunate after I left the State Department to be invited down to Richard Branson's famous island, Necker Island, which is the site of an annual blockchain summit. And this summit, you, Sandra, of course, are one of the longtime participants, brings together a really extraordinary community. It's people from around the world that have both the capacity and the interest in solving big global challenges and looking at how decentralized technology can play a role in making that happen. One year during the summit, we had a variety of great ideas that came together. There was, I think, a realization that the ecosystem had matured to a point that we needed global architecture to start knitting people together. This is a technology, blockchain technology, that almost by definition is much more powerful when it can transcend borders and break down silos. And so there was, I think, a consensus among all of the participants at this summit that we had to start creating the superstructure that would enable different communities and constituencies and companies all over the planet to start a conversation about how they could apply these tools within the work that they were doing. At the time, this was still quite a few years ago, early enough in the blockchain ecosystem that there really wasn't any global infrastructure to support that type of dialogue. And 6 months after our summit on Necker Island at Davos, the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, we announced and kicked off the launch of the Global Blockchain Business Council. I made a mistake at that meeting, which is that everybody else went up the chairlift to have a good time, and I went and got some work done, was doing something boring. And when folks came down the chairlift, they said, "We have it all figured out. you're going to be the chairman of GBBC. It actually was not a mistake. It turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful privilege and experience, and has given me a chance to work with you and many others in the GBBC community extensively over the last few years. The end result was an organization that has grown from a great idea, but was really nothing more than an idea at that point, to its status today as really the preeminent umbrella organization for the decentralized technology ecosystem, and one with ambassadors and representatives and activities in well over 50 countries around the world. That is a credit to you, Sandra, but it's been a privilege to be a part of that journey.
Well, it's been no short of a global team effort, and we thank you very much for being one of the critical founders of the organization. And let's face it, we're still growing and evolving, so it's been a great journey. I want to now, we're going to tie all this together, but I want to move on to what you are doing specifically at New America and why it's so critical that we talk about digital infrastructure.
Well, when I was at the State Department, I sat down one day with the president of Estonia, Toomas Ilves. And Estonia, for those that don't know, has built out one of the most comprehensive e-government platforms in the world. And it's not just an e-government platform, it really powers their society. And the benefits to Estonians are extraordinary. They recoup savings equivalent to about 2% of GDP each year, which is a remarkable number. And they also save the equivalent of hundreds and hundreds of years of time each year because their systems are so much more efficient. For Americans over the last 12 months in particular, we've had kind of an unrelenting barrage of reminders that our systems just aren't working very well right now. But the same is true in many countries around the planet. You have institutions designed in the 19th century using technology from the 20th century to try and solve the issues of the 21st century, and it's just not working out so well. And that shows up whether you're a single mom waiting by your mailbox for months and months for unemployment checks or fiscal stimulus money that just isn't showing up. It shows up in the vulnerabilities we have in our cyber infrastructure to things like the SolarWinds hack. It shows up even in attacks on the integrity of voting registries that can ultimately threaten our democracy and cause people to take really horrific actions if they don't believe in the integrity of our electoral processes. So we've got a whole bunch of issues that we are wrestling with right now because our digital systems aren't working the way that they should. So based on these conversations that began with the leadership of Estonia, we started asking what would be required to provide every country in the world with access to high quality, world-class systems that could hardwire efficiency, accountability, transparency, productivity into our institutions. And about 3 years ago, we pulled together a group together with the Rockefeller Foundation at an amazing spot they have in Bellagio, Italy.
Not bad.
From this conversation between Necker Island and Bellagio, you're getting a very non-representative sample of my traditional travel itineraries. But we sat together with heads of government, some of the top leaders in the technology community for a couple of days and mapped out the blueprint for what a comprehensive open source digital stack would look like in countries around the world. And looked at what are the key pieces, what are the elements that you would need in order to create really high quality open source infrastructure that any country in the world could adapt to meet their needs. And based on those initial conversations, our great partners at the Rockefeller Foundation came forward with some significant financial support to start building out and testing whether this hypothesis could work. With those resources, we have developed a variety of different platforms. We've worked with New York City, the State Department, the Department of Justice, Baltimore, New Jersey, a number of other jurisdictions around the world to develop open source solutions that can power public institutions. And then we're also working in close collaboration with organizations like the Gates Foundation and the Omidyar Network that are creating solutions around foundational digital identity and digital payments, a number of other key pieces of infrastructure that you really need in order to bring societies into the 21st century. We're at a point right now where this experiment is working. We have enough evidence from enough different countries around the world that the question is no longer whether these platforms are effective. We know they're effective. They've lifted 2% of the population out of poverty in Kenya. In Ukraine, they've cut public procurement fraud in half in just a very short period of time. They are in Bangladesh returning citizens the equivalent of 2 billion days of time. So just unbelievable savings,
Yeah.
billions and billions of dollars that it would have previously been lost to corruption that is no longer getting lost to corruption. So this is a really, really big deal if we can do it right. And our goal right now is to make those platforms available, a comprehensive set of digital platforms available to every responsible government in the world by the time we hit the 2030 target for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And fortunately, we're well on our way to getting there. I don't think that is an overly optimistic target. I think we're going to hit it.
Wow, amazing. And there's a phrase that bandies about sometimes, institutions in a box, in reference to these open platforms. What do you mean by that? Could you explain a little bit what that means?
So this was a great articulation of a concept that we'd been working on already for a while by that point. But I'd been having a discussion with Joe Lubin, the founder of Consensus, who is a GBBC member, and was chatting with Joe yesterday about the fact that you have so many countries in the world where, again, the institutions aren't operating the way that they should. And if you could take open source infrastructure and the power of open source technology, where, for those that aren't as familiar with the space, we build out really high quality 80% solutions with the expectation that the last 20% can be customized and optimized to meet the needs of different use cases and different communities. If you could take that approach to designing solutions for institutions, you could do a whole lot of good in the world real quickly. And so with that in mind, we have been creating institutions in a box that help people do everything from get a job. And we've deployed a great jobs platform in partnership with the state of New Jersey that is supercharging their efforts to put people back to work, to move resources transparently, which is a problem that we've tackled with the Department of Justice and the State Department. To make it easier for people to demonstrate their eligibility for different government services, which is something that we've done together with New York City and Baltimore and a growing number of jurisdictions around the country. So you need good, tight systems that can be deployed quickly, optimized easily, and that are interoperable and modular. And if you can do all of that in the context of open source technology, it actually turns out it's not that hard to really change the world in a very positive way pretty quickly, which is what we're going for with this work.
I love it. And normally I wouldn't necessarily turn to questions so early on in our conversation because I've got a few more of my own. However, they're very relevant to all the things that you've just recently said. So I'm going to pose a few here to you. From Anonymous, how do DIGI and the Rockefeller Foundation determine with whom they work? How do you decide which jurisdictions? Because presumably nearly every jurisdiction could use your help.
We like to think so, and it's a great question. We, for the last couple of years, have been in improving mode. So we wanted to demonstrate if this model could work. We developed, by virtue of that, a pretty sophisticated framework that we utilize in determining which projects we're going to pursue. And it incorporates a lot of different variables, and we can represent them graphically to give us a pretty quick uh, at a glance estimate of whether a country or a government is going to be a good partner or not. We look at everything from where different jurisdictions are in their political cycle, because it turns out if you get folks too late in an election cycle or too close to an election,
Right.
the work can get derailed or put on hold while folks deal with an election, to their capacity, to the level of political support, to interoperability with existing technology platforms. There are a whole bunch of different variables that we take into account. The system seems to have worked in that we have had a very, very high success rate with our programs, far more than you would traditionally find in a startup technology environment. And candidly, working with governments on technology issues is incredibly hard. About 87% of all government technology programs fail. And so by virtue of that, we knew we were climbing a steep hill when we got into this,
Sure.
and this analysis framework seems to have served us well. Some corporates like Microsoft have actually collaborated with us and have taken our evaluation framework and now adapted it to their own needs. And so we're delighted to see that portion of our open source methodology scaling to other organizations that work on related challenges. But there are a bunch of different issues that we need to factor in when determining who we're going to collaborate with. Now that we have proven the model, we're trying to relax some of those criteria
Mhm.
and work with more partners in more unexpected settings. So that's one of the things we're working on in our 2021 timeline and hopefully in years to come.
Sure. That's amazing. And I think a good follow-on is a question from Eric, who asks, when it comes to onboarding these governments, what are some of the challenges that you see in the onboarding besides the normal bureaucracy and obviously lots of decision points along the way? Um, could you share with us some of your experiences on what some of the big challenges are? Because the will
Yeah,
is
so
really there, right?
it's a great question. And I think we have to come to this with a recognition that technology has transformed virtually every aspect of our lives over the last few decades, except the way we interact with the public institutions that are at the foundation of our societies. And in all but a handful of countries, that remains a very analog process and frankly, a pretty broken process in a lot of respects. So you need to go in with a recognition that these institutions are trying hard to play catch up. In most instances, you've got really well-intentioned people who are trying to solve these problems, but these are institutions that were set up many, many decades ago. They're not designed for iteration. They're not designed for innovation. And the processes that they use around things like procurement, how they buy stuff, don't even envision the availability of open source tools. So there are some pretty basic hurdles, some pretty basic issues that we have to deal with. We are working right now with some amazing partners to redesign the way that governments do procurement. This is a $13 trillion problem. And once you can create really high quality open source procurement platforms, you unlock that $13 trillion of spend, not only to be deployed a lot more effectively, because right now, overwhelmingly, when governments do technology, they're buying very large, very siloed, very fragmented systems. And they'll spend $100 million on a project that locks them into a single vendor and isn't interoperable with anything else across government, which is a huge issue. So you've got to deal with some issues like that. You've got to ensure that you have political support at the very top, because oftentimes making the changes required to fix these problems will entail some tough decisions. And so you need to have the backing of leaders who are ultimately accountable to their people for the choices that are being made. But if you do that, we think there is a real moment of opportunity to rethink digital infrastructure. All governments have the same problems, but they don't generally have them at the same time. And over the last year, everybody has had the same problems at the same time. And the solution is better digital systems and better digital infrastructure. So this is the moment to solve this stuff if we can do it right.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. And there's a technical question here, or not technical, but they're just asking, how do you go about determining who is the technology partner, or do the governments do that, or just DIGI?
So when we collaborate, we tend to, in most cases, run an open tender looking for the right technology partners with whom to collaborate on these projects. The way to think about the work that our team does is a little bit like the general contractor on a house. Our friends in government will know that they've got a problem that needs to be solved. We'll have some ideas on how to do that, and we've done it in enough different contexts that we have a pretty good feel for what works and what doesn't work. And then we use generally philanthropic capital, but occasionally public funds and tax dollars as well, to identify the right technology partners to collaborate with on that effort. One
Okay.
of the big issues you see around the world, and one of the reasons that almost 90% of government technology projects don't succeed, is that these are communities that tend to speak pretty different languages. So you've got tech folks that speak tech, and you've got
Right.
government folks that speak government.
Right.
And our team is pretty bilingual. So we've got folks that are very comfortable serving as translators between those two different realms, and that's work that we take pretty seriously. And so we take advantage of the knowledge and the experience that exists within our extended team to identify good tech providers that can work with us. And then we're very hands-on in the process. This isn't just a select a partner and go home type of undertaking. We are very much in the trenches alongside our technical providers in building out and optimizing these open source solutions. But it's a great question.
Awesome. And I would presume if anyone's interested in partnering, they should reach out to the team through the website.
Please.
Okay, great. Good to know. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. You've got a couple questions relating to your time at the State Department. You say you formed a group. Does it still exist today, or has it taken different shape?
So the work still exists, and the work is ongoing. A lot of the projects that we began have grown into pretty substantial undertakings. The Trump administration did not continue the office itself, but they did continue a lot of the projects. I'll mention just a few that I'm proud of that have gone on to do some good. We were approached by a lot of universities around the country who said, we've got amazing research and innovation capacity, and we'd like to help advance the work of the State Department and the work of diplomacy on behalf of the United States. But we don't know how to do that. The State Department didn't really know how to do that either. And so we built out one big initiative called Diplomacy Lab, that course sources tough innovation and research challenges from the State Department to faculty-led teams at universities all over the country. And at this point, it's hundreds and hundreds of different university teams that have participated in these efforts and have enabled the State Department to access the incredible expertise and capacity of US faculty members and also their students, which has been a huge benefit because especially in the world of innovation and technology, oftentimes students will have insights that those of us that are growing a little bit long in the tooth may not be able to furnish. So that's been a huge success. I was asked to revitalize an organization called the Community of Democracies that serves as a mini United Nations for the world's democratic governments. And that's been very successful and important. And then there were some specific platforms that we built out. One day, Secretary Clinton came to me at dinner about 6 months after the start of the Arab Spring, and she said, look, we've got an issue. We have people in countries like Tunisia and Moldova that were pulled out of jail where they were political prisoners and are now leading big government ministries, or they were academics and have been pulled out of universities to serve as presidents or prime ministers. And they don't have a user's manual for how you set up a new democracy, and we're making a lot of unforced errors as a result of this. is there something we can do to solve this problem? And so we built out a network of leaders all over the world, about 50 former presidents and prime ministers, Supreme Court justices, many of the top leaders from democratic transitions that had occurred over the prior 2 decades. And then with some incredible technology partners, built out a platform that organized their expertise and connected folks with real-time voice, video, and text communication with a translation overlay. And then when leaders in Tunisia, for example, were developing their constitution, every time they got a paragraph of text that they thought looked pretty good, they would share it with this network around the world and get real-time feedback on what had worked in different countries, and more importantly, what hadn't worked in different countries. And
Wow.
by virtue of that, Tunisia was able to develop what is now almost without question the best constitution in the Arab world. And so projects like that are still very much ongoing. We'll see what the new administration and my old boss, Tony Blinken, does as they come into this space, but I know he's excited about this type of work as well.
Oh, fascinating. And I have to say, truly remarkable. It's like open source constitution building and getting everyone's feedback around the world. That's very cool. So let's talk a bit about public-private partnerships. And a lot of what you do is very much that. I think the PPP, the rise of PPP is maybe becoming more mainstream in terms of the consciousness of people understanding what that is. But frankly, it's been around for quite a while. How do you see the best way for public-private partnerships to work? And you're obviously doing that right now as we speak. How do you see that working, particularly in the US, for example?
Different sectors of society have different capabilities, and that shouldn't shock us. When I worked with Secretary Clinton, we often spoke about a three-legged stool that you need to have balanced in order for a society to function well. So you need democratic institutions where political activity takes place, and we do the work of the public and are accountable to people. You need the private sector where we innovate really well and where we can collaborate for financial gain. And then you need civil society, which are the civic organizations and nonprofits that enable people to come together and work through peaceful means to improve their societies. And what we have seen in our work is that in order for public-private partnerships to really thrive, you need everybody at the table. You need all three of those communities represented because they each bring different capabilities. And the problems that we need to solve today are too big for government alone in many instances. If you think back to the aftermath of the Second World War, when a lot of our institutions kind of came into their current form, that was a moment when almost every problem on the planet worth solving could be solved by government. There was very little in the way of big global challenges that couldn't be addressed by government. You fast forward to today, there is hardly a problem worth solving that can be solved by government alone. And so it's not that government is irrelevant, but they just can't do this on their own. So we try to get everybody at the table. We try to leverage different types of capital depending on the challenge we are looking to solve. If you want to do leading edge innovation, philanthropic capital is really important in those settings because philanthropy can take risks that governments oftentimes can't take. And they're a little bit more reticent to put taxpayer dollars into something that isn't proven yet. If you want to scale something, then oftentimes you will need public money because philanthropy, while it's gotten a lot bigger, still doesn't have nearly the capacity that government has. And if you want to look after the public's interest, you really need civil society at the table. They've got their fingers on the pulse. They can see around corners that folks who are head down in government aren't going to find. And then, frankly, at least as our institutions are structured today, you've got to have private sector folks who can build the groundbreaking, innovative solutions that are needed to address these challenges. So, my advice would be find some space at the intersection of government, civil society, and the private sector on the issues that you care about, and start building your public-private partnership there, and you will hopefully have good results.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that. Um, there's a question here related to some comments you made around and some statistics you actually provided around some of the savings, whether it was hours or actual monetary value saved. The person is asking, how long does it take for governments or public sector organizations on average to realize the savings that you mentioned? Is it a 1-year implementation and you can take that sort of snapshot, or is it really more of a 5-year plus duration?
So it depends a lot on the system that you are deploying. In some cases, one of the platforms I alluded to is Ukraine's new open source public procurement platform, which is called Prozoro. Ukraine, I don't think it's any secret, had really, really big issues with corruption. And a lot of the money that they were spending on public procurement or privatization projects wasn't ending up in the right place and wasn't actually serving the public's interest. They worked with some amazing partners, Transparency International, a number of other organizations, to build out a world-class system for public procurement based on open source technology. It's one of the best that exists anywhere at this point. And very, very quickly, within I think the first year after rolling out that platform, they saw perceptions of corruption, which is the accurate measure that is generally used to quantify these things, fall by half around the public procurement activity. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
To have that type of drop in 1 year suggests that something is working and it's working pretty well. We see other evidence of progress that is only clear with a slightly longer time horizon, but the progress tends to be pretty immediate. So in the case of digital payments, if you look at Kenya, we now have had digital payments in place in Kenya for a while. What we only just found out about is that that platform has lifted 2% of the population out of poverty. That's
Wow.
remarkable. And that's exclusively due to the availability of digital payments, no other systems involved. So when you see things like that with the benefit of a little time, or if you see the 2 billion days of saved time in Bangladesh, or the billion days that people didn't have to spend visiting government offices in Bangladesh, it's pretty easy to quantify this and say, we're making real progress here. You don't necessarily have to wait 20 years to see the results show up. All of this work is long term, so I don't want to give the impression that any of this stuff happens overnight. You need to take a pretty patient approach to these initiatives, but some of the payout in terms of the public's understanding of how their life is improving actually happens pretty quickly, which is exciting. We see that, last thing I'll mention on this, in the work that we're doing in New Jersey on jobs. We have folks that are getting jobs today because they're using the platform that we helped design. And these are people that wouldn't have been getting jobs otherwise. So if you interview them and talk to them, as we and our partners at the Rockefeller Foundation have done, they're pretty clear on what the benefits are.
Awesome. I think you need to bring that to every state. Um,
We're ready.
Tristan's asking, was the digital payment system in Kenya you're referring to M-Pesa or something else?
Yes. And M-Pesa, I think it's important to clarify, is privately held and is not open source and is a monopoly. So, what we see with M-Pesa are the benefits that come from these types of systems. What we are now finding, both with the spread of blockchain-based payments and digital currency, but also some very innovative new solutions like Mojaloop, which is an open source payments platform, is that you can provide those same benefits while also avoiding the challenges of vendor lock-in and overly centralized monopolistic systems.
Right.
So it's important to specify, and I appreciate the question on that.
Great. And Tristan's actually also asking, what kind of projects, besides the DIGI projects, have you seen that have effectively bridged the gap between public and private capabilities? Are there any projects that come to mind that you'd like to highlight?
So as we look at these challenges, we see a few foundational layers that are really important for solving public sector problems and private sector problems. And it doesn't really matter where you're coming from, you want to get these foundational layers right. And the foundation layers that we've identified are digital identity. And there you have systems like MOSIP, which is the modular open source identity platform, and now a growing bouquet of blockchain-based digital identity solutions, many of which, and I think this is really important, are starting to incorporate elements that give people a lot greater control over their information. And that's something we can talk about more, but we think is going to be really fundamental to getting a tech stack right over the next 2, 3 decades. We see a real need for digital payments, which I've discussed a little bit already, but you've got to have good digital payments infrastructure in place. The US is not in a happy spot when it comes to this. Our payments infrastructure, while those of us that have access to checking accounts and credit cards may think it works pretty well, it doesn't, and we have a lot of work that needs to happen there. And the fact that we have had so many people waiting so long for public benefits over the last year should be an indicator to all of us that something is broken. And by the way, since you've gotten me on this, up to $200 billion in public money stolen as a result of these broken systems. So
Just
unbelievable
so
expenses and costs.
crazy to me.
It is insane. And Americans aren't paying attention to this. If they were paying attention, they would be in the streets demanding that we develop new digital systems to get this stuff right. Because the failures of the status quo are so monumental and so expensive. And the sad thing is, it's not just that the money is going to cyber criminals, and it is, and the latest results out this week suggest, as I mentioned, $200 billion of CARES Act money may have been taken by cyber criminals, but it's not getting to the people who need it most. And you have 10 million Americans living in poverty who qualify for benefits, who aren't able to access these systems because they're not designed well and they're broken. And in many cases, they are set up to not be equitable and not provide different communities with the ability to tap into these benefits. So you need payment systems that work. And then you need data exchange systems that work. We see this with Estonia's X-Road system, how fundamentally important it has been to moving information around society. And we think that going forward, if we're going to break out of the neo-feudal model that we're stuck in right now, where each of us wake up every morning and start creating data for free that profits a handful of folks sitting in digital manor houses in Silicon Valley and Seattle, then we're going to have good data exchange layers. So those are the three that we are paying a lot of attention to, but we've also helped develop platforms for land registries. We've worked on voting and civic participation. We think voting registries are going to be incredibly important over the next few years. And we see a lot of work to be done around taxation and public finance. Our existing taxation and public finance systems just don't work the way they should. We have lots of people that are going to spend way, way too much time over the next few months calculating their taxes. In places that do this right, like Estonia and Singapore, it's about 2 minutes and a postcard and you're done. And that's what we should have in
Oh,
the United
yeah,
States as well.
absolutely. And even in the UK, it took me probably no more than 10, 15 minutes because the
Yeah.
system is that easy. But the US system seems to be the complete opposite. Lots of room for improvement. Completely agree with you, Tomicah. And since you brought up the topic around data management, which I think is so crucial, let's talk a bit more about that in our last 10 minutes together, because I fundamentally think if we mess this up and we don't bring data creation, data ownership back to the people, we're going to have decades of just suffering going down the road. So please share with us some more of your thoughts around how we can thoughtfully think about how we bring data management, data ownership back to the individual or to the groups of people that actually create it.
Well, I totally agree. This is one of the foundational questions that we're either going to fix, because it certainly is not fixed right now, or we're going to be stuck in a pretty dark place for a long time. Folks tend to act like the paradigm that we're in right now is unprecedented and that there isn't really anything you can use as an analog. I disagree with that description. We've actually spent a fair amount of time studying the feudal system and feudalism. And it is an almost perfect match for the way that we design and utilize data architecture today. If you think about it, in feudal times, you had a whole bunch of folks that needed access to land in order to grow crops. They needed access to protection from marauders and tribes, and they were willing to give up a lot of their production and a lot of their rights in order to get those two things. And we have very similar dynamics today. All of us need access to some basic digital services, and all of us need protection from hackers and bad actors that would steal our data outright. And so we are giving up an enormous amount of value and a lot of our rights in order to gain access to those things in the form of services provided by Facebook or Amazon or Google or a lot of other big technology companies. And the good news is we have in the end of feudalism a model. We saw a couple of events that fundamentally shifted the way people treated property and people treated individual liberty and individual rights. You had a pandemic, and the Black Death fundamentally shifted the equation around labor and the rights of labor and the value of labor in that society. You had new infrastructure that came online. Previously, if you wanted to sell your goods and you were a farmer, the only option you had was to sell it to your local lord, because that was the only place that the roads went. All the roads
Right.
went to the local lord. You had a bunch of new ideas around the Enlightenment that said individuals should have rights, individuals should be able to own private property. We can do that today. We've got a pandemic, and that pandemic is forcing us to reevaluate the value of data. We have new infrastructure, especially decentralized infrastructure and blockchain technology, that is making it possible for us to use data differently and arrange the custodianship of data differently than we would have in the past and give people back control of the information they create. And we've got some really powerful new ideas on how these systems could be designed. So the ingredients are all there. The question is whether we're going to be able to muster the political will, like reformers of the Scottish Enlightenment did, in order to put some of these ideas into force. And my hope, and frankly, my expectation is that we are going to see some big changes in this space. The status quo is neither desirable nor sustainable, and folks recognize that.
Yeah. And I will say, just to add on to that, Tomicah, you painted actually an amazing analogy that this is actually not as like new as people think, that this has actually happened before, and it's actually a pretty close, mirror model. When I think about what also needs to happen is, the competition piece. We have too many monopolies that control too many parts of very critical infrastructure in the digital world. And I think the decentralization concepts and blockchain coming in that involve lots of different stakeholders collaborating together. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I do think introducing more competition is key. And we've got to work with governments and regulators to allow that.
Absolutely. And just to stretch this analogy a little further, during the feudal era, because the feudal lords controlled virtually everything, they set the terms of the market. They defined which mills you could use if you wanted to grind your grain. They defined which wine presses you could use if you wanted to crush your grapes. It was really, really difficult for people to break out of that. And it got to a point eventually where the feudal lords could determine who you were going to marry and approve marriages. We see a lot of those same dynamics today. We give up our data to online dating sites that determine who we're going to be partnered with and paired with. We see a lot of big marketplaces determining who we can trade with and using algorithms to define how we're going to be able to engage in commercial activity. So we need to recognize the path that we're on. And once we acknowledge that problem, I think we have an opportunity to change the course and hopefully come up with a new set of solutions. But I totally agree.
Fantastic. And this is for a much bigger discussion point, but I know we've had some discussions with various groups within the Senate around data privacy, but also data regulation. And does that mean the tech sector actually should be regulated? If you look at every other major industry in the world, or in the US, let's just stick here, healthcare, financial services, they're all regulated to some degree. And then the question is, but how would you go about looking at algorithms and things that sit in black boxes? And these are challenges I think we just really, frankly, as a society haven't addressed very well yet.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And what we see as we look at these issues is that we need, in this case, some new governance models. You're
Yeah.
totally correct. We know how to deal with hazardous technologies. We've done that with nuclear power. We've done that with chemicals. We've done that with pharmaceuticals. We've done it with just about everything. So it's not as though we have, as a society, haven't figured out yet how to deal with hazardous, potentially dangerous forms of innovation. But what we also, I think, should start looking at real closely in this regard is how we can do a better job of leveraging the expertise and the capabilities of different sectors when it comes to governing technology and regulating technology. So this is something that, as I mentioned earlier, is too important to be left to government alone. But we see some exciting models in other parts of the world where you bring together the tech industry, you bring together universities and civil society, and you bring together regulators, and you co-create models that hopefully work for everyone and protect those that are vulnerable in society while still enabling a lot of really dynamic, fast-moving innovation, which we urgently need. So I think there are ways to solve for this. There are ways to take advantage of the incredible tools that are being developed within the tech ecosystem without as many of the unforced errors and potentially devastating consequences that we've seen over the last 15 years of totally laissez-faire engagement around tech. There has to be a better way of doing things than we're doing it right now.
Yeah. And then the opposite extreme to try to take a hammer to every single thing and destroy it is also, the other
Totally,
extreme
totally.
of a blunt tool, and not really the most effective way of dealing with what we've got going on right now. Appreciate that. And you've got actually a whole bunch of questions, which we're not going to have time for, but I'm going to let you have the last 2 minutes, Tomicah, leaving us with your thoughts. And we will, by the way, for the audience who's asking, they love all the examples that you've provided. There is a website. Yes, go to New America's website. We'll provide that in the recording release when we go back out to all those who've joined. Thank you for your interest. There's questions about New Jersey. There's questions around Kenya. Clearly, people are very delighted to hear all the great work that you're doing, Tomicah. But in the last minute or two, can you just share with us how you see 2021 into the future, your own view on where we go from here and what we can all do to make sure that we participate and collaborate?
Well, for me, if you think about the moment we're in, and you think about some of the parallels that exist from the past, take yourself back if you can to 1921 and some of the big innovations that had just come online at that point in world history. You had the automobile, which was getting ready to transform the way we move around the world. You had aviation, which was just getting started. These were totally transformational ideas and tools that were as big as anything in terms of their impact that as we've seen in a very long time as human beings. But in order to derive the full benefits of those innovations, you needed investment in two areas. You needed infrastructure, which linked us all together, and airplanes and cars aren't worth a whole lot unless you have roads and you have airports.
Yeah.
And then you also needed some regulation because nobody was going to trust these systems unless you had good interoperability and you knew that if you went to land at an airport, that airport was going to be set up to accommodate your plane safely, or when you showed up at a light, you were going to get a red light and not a purple light to show you which direction you needed to go. So you do need to have some rules of the road in order to take advantage of these innovations. I think we're in a similar place right now. We have had just this breathtaking run of digital innovation that has produced extraordinary new tools that we know are already having a profound impact on the way we live our lives. But if we're going to be able to achieve the full benefits of those tools, then we need to start investing in infrastructure, and I would highlight open source infrastructure
Yep.
as a means to bring us all together and enable us to collaborate more effectively and fairly and equitably than we can right now. And we're going to need a little bit of regulation, not to stifle the innovation, but to ensure that there's competition and interoperability, and that we can all take advantage of these new tools and the data that they provide in a manner that is going to help us solve lots of problems and not simply make an enormous amount of money for a small number of people, which is much of what we've seen to date. I think we can do that. I think this is the moment to do that. I think the pieces are all in place. And so, frankly, this comes down to us. It comes down to you and me and the people on this call, all of whom are fortunate enough to have access to powerful ideas that can help move us in the right direction. It's why the work that you're doing, Sandra, is so important. It's why the work of the GBBC is so important, and why I am very proud and grateful to be part of this family. So thank you for everything you're doing, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, thank you, Tomicah, and all of your initiatives at New America, and co-creation, collaboration, that will continue to do that around the world. Thank you very much. And over to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much to Mike and Sandra for your time today. That was a wonderful conversation. And to everyone who tuned in today, we will share a recording of this on our YouTube and also circulate the links to learn more about DIGI and the projects they have going on. Also, as a reminder, we host these conversations every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. GMT. So you can join us next week for a conversation with Greg Medcraft, Director for Financial and Enterprise Affairs at the OECD. Thanks again, Sandra and Tomicah, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you.